This is TWiT.
You wrote about these tariffs. You called it a nightmare scenario for manufacturers, which got my attention. First, talk a little bit about the tariffs announced on Monday and what kinds of technology will be directly affected most.
Yeah, so it's kind of everything that's left. We had seen in September, an earlier round went in, and they were kind of it was along with sort of the steel and soybean tariffs. We'd seen previous ones on computer components, a lot of freestanding batteries, things like that. And one of the things that was said at the time was they were like, look, if you're going to add if you're going to add tariffs on more products, it's going to have to really be everything else. Those previous tariffs were sort of written in a way that it avoided the big ticket items like smartphones, laptops, the stuff that people are really sort of watching the price when they buy, and that whole industries in the U.S. are really counting on. Now it's kind of everything that's left. I think the one thing that has been left out is pharmaceuticals, but I think if you're manufacturing goods in China at this point, you are getting hit by this in some way.
And when do these go into effect? Like I imagine like this isn't an immediate as of now. There's got to be a little bit of ramp up, and why would there be any sort of ramp up or delay on these going into effect?
So officially it's on June 17th, they're going to start sort of talks about it, and then on June 25th, it's scheduled to go into effect. The talks, the June 17th stuff is sort of, there's a comment period where citizens can weigh in and sort of people can say, oh, this is going to be bad for my business. Otherwise, I mean, I will say that's a very, very short window of time between announcing a tariff and the tariff going into effect. Usually with the point of these things is to give people time to shift their manufacturing so that it's not in China, right? You say, okay, anyone after this date who's still importing TVs from China is going to get hit with this tariff, so you better move your stuff to Mexico. You have 1 year. And then that's already itself a hard enough task. If you say, okay, you have 6 or 7 weeks, there's just nothing people can do to avoid, that is not enough time to change the way you are building your product in any kind of reasonable way. So the thing that people are hoping, and this also just adds to the uncertainty, is there's a G20 meeting in June. We know that Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping are both going to be there. They will presumably talk about this. We've already been through a couple sort of cycles where they were getting together to talk about a trade deal and it sort of fell apart. But that's really the last-ditch thing before these go into effect. And, of course, there's another round of Chinese tariffs on American goods that will also go into effect if that sort of round of things fails.
So what kind of effects will consumers start to feel, and when will they feel them if these do go into effect?
Yeah, so that's where things get interesting. Generally, there are only three places the money can come from, right? So this is it's a tax that's collected on goods as they're imported. So it is collecting this money. Where does the money come from? Either the company just eats the cost, or they use this to negotiate a better deal from suppliers and say, hey, give it to me a little cheaper because I got to pay this tax, which you can get a little bit of give on. But generally, they just sort of pass it along to consumers. I mean, I think the JP Morgan did a survey. It's not an exact one-to-one thing because what are the values of the goods as they're imported versus the retail value when they're sold? We only ever see the retail price. But if you think about, so their estimate was that a $1,000 iPhone XS would have to be, it would add $149 to the price tag of that if they just passed it along, right? Probably Apple's margins are high enough, and they had a pretty specific reason to put the iPhone XS at $1,000, and they probably don't want to abandon that as just because of this. So they will probably just eat the cost because they're Apple and they can, and they have all this cash in the bank. And who knows how long any of this will last. But if you're Lenovo, if you're HP, if you're sort of a more commodity cost-conscious product, you probably don't have that much room to give. Those margins on, if you're not Apple and you're importing electronics from China, your margins are usually pretty small, and that ends up with costs just passed directly along to the consumer. I mean, and there's sort of, that's what taxes do. It's a sales tax.
Yeah, and there's so much. I mean, we were just talking about OnePlus in the previous segment. There's so many, brands now, at least in the world of smartphones, that are hinging themselves around this kind of quality components at a lower price. This would potentially, depending on the company, almost force them to kind of raise their prices, and goes kind of against what they're all about in the first place at that point. That's a big challenge. How long will it take for these price increases, do you think, to be visible to buyers? Do you expect people to it's like, get them while you can, get in there fast, because suddenly, you're basically saving a certain percentage if you buy now versus waiting? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think probably we're at least safe until June. And I think, supply chains are very complicated things. Part of the question you're asking is how much stock does Lenovo have in its warehouse, and how much can it import before the deadline goes in to put in a warehouse in California somewhere where then it can be sort of moved out. I don't know. It's tricky. Again, you also don't want to raise the price too much or drop it too much. So they may just decide, okay, we have this new thing, we're going to raise the price on that to recoup the way these things get set are very complicated. And so that can be a little tricky to say. The other thing I would say is in the long term, 3, 4, 5 years from now, if these are still in effect, then the companies, their first reaction when they see this is, okay, how do we get around this? Everything we're making in China, let's just send it to Europe, and let's sort of create some new place outside of China to create the stuff that's going to the US so that won't get hit with the tariffs. That's pretty hard to do. Electronics manufacturing is not a simple business. There's not that many places outside of China to do it, but there are other places. Everyone is now going to be rushing to those places. But eventually they will set that up, and that will just be sort of a permanent shift, because you never know. You think about 5 years ago, who thought that in 2019 they would be dealing with a 25% tax on all the electronics that were coming from China into the US? You never would have prepared for that kind of contingency. It would have seemed impossible. So now we're having to bet, what are the trade barriers going to be what are the trade barriers going to be in 2024? It's a hard question. You got to kind of see the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you spoke earlier about how companies reshape their supply chain and how it usually can take up to a year, and they don't have a year. Are companies already starting to do that now, just in preparation, as these continue?
Yeah, it's tricky, because also they don't want to say too much about where they're building, what they're building, because trade secrets and all of that. I will say one of the names that's been thrown around a lot is that Samsung has actually already started to do this, and is probably not going to get hit that hard by this, because they have so many sort of solid manufacturing outposts outside of China, in places like Vietnam, sort of elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Why did they choose to do that? Was it because they saw sort of the whole Trump situation coming? I don't know. Or was it that there was sort of, there's a lot of other kind of contingencies to the politics of China and Korea. But there are companies who have started to shift away from China. And in many cases, it's been cheaper if you're sort of able to do it right. But there's just still a lot of manufacturing for U.S. customers that happens in China. I mean, it is the global hub of this stuff. So, I do think this is one of those times where you find out who's getting hit and who has sort of secretly been preparing for this for the last few years.
Yeah, right. Who has had the foresight and the straight up ability to weather the storm? Well, I guess we'll find out. What is not touched yet? As relates to technology, you were talking about earlier tariffs touching parts of technology. This being a pretty major one for things that we talk about all the time, things like computers and cell phones and stuff. What's the next frontier? The next tariff frontier as far as what we can look forward to with technology.
Well, yeah, so it may not be tariffs. It may get into sort of hairier business. There's this whole situation with Huawei and,
right.
executives being arrested in Canada. Canadian executives in China have since been detained seemingly in retaliation.
Yeah.
If this is going to really be playing hardball, which it seems like it is, and so we go through another, no one thought that we would get here, right? Like the even before these came in, there was another round that went from 10% tax to 25% tax. And everyone said, oh, they'll never let that happen. By the time that's going to go into effect, we will have worked out a deal. It's just pressure for the deal. Well, if this keeps escalating, then yeah, Apple has a lot of sort of operations in China. Does it get harder for Apple and other United States companies to operate in China just on a very basic, like, can I get to the office? Can I enter the country in order to do the business of Apple there? Or are they just going to go into the Apple store and say, oh no, this belongs to the government now, right? I don't think we're going to get that far, but also I didn't think we would get as far as we are now. So if things get really hairy, there is other stuff other than taxing imports that China can do, which is sort of an alarming place to be. And there's other stuff we can do too. So I don't know. I hope it doesn't get there, but you never know.